Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dr. Hathcock, and with this topic of westward expansion, we're getting into material that's going to be on exam number 2. So let's look at this desire to head west for our country. Okay, so we've already kind of established that there was a lot of immigration coming into the United States. It was happening during the Civil War. It really kicked up after the Civil War. But you did have a lot of people headed this way from both Europe and Asia, starting in the 1860s. In fact, by 1900, you've got like tens of millions of immigrants having arrived in the United States. One thing that was an incentive for immigrating to the U.S. Was passage of a Homestead Act in 1862. This idea of a Homestead Act was basically that if you could go live in the land out west, like in the territories, if you will, but if you're willing to move out west to those territories, the United States government was willing to give you that land for free. Now, there were some strings attached to it. You had to live on the land for at least 5 years. You also had to make some type of improvements to the land. And that could be as simple as like just building a little house, cutting down trees, planting crops. Any of those things would have been considered improvements. But if you did that, you lived there for 5 years, improved the land, you could get up to 160 acres of land that would be yours out west. This really was quite an incentive for people to head this way. Now you'll notice the year 1862 is when the first Homestead Act will be passed. People out to the northwest of the United States, think like Illinois, Indiana, places like that, they really wanted that land opened up for free like in the 1850s. But the South kept blocking homestead laws from being passed because it was made very clear they wouldn't be allowed to take their slaves with them to that free land out west. But finally, in 1862, you have a Congress that is all Northern, right? The South had seceded at that point. The country found itself in civil war. So in 1862, an all Northern Congress passes the first of a series of homestead laws for the country. The United States sent flyers to Europe, sort of advertising that free land. If you think about like being an Irishman at that time, you're probably living on some English lord's land. He probably owns like 40 acres, and that makes him some big to-do type of guy. And if you can get to this thing called America, they'll give you 4 times what this lord you work for owns. It's kind of a feeling of you could be your own king, your own nobleman, if you could get to the United States and live out there for 5 years and improve that land and get 160 acres. Of course, in advertising that land, they didn't really talk about the negatives that were involved. And there are negatives involved. There's there's Native Americans out west that don't really want you living on their land. If you look at the Great Plains of the United States, which is where a lot of these homesteads are going to pop up, there's not a lot of forests. There's not a lot of trees to cut down to turn into wood and things like that. So it was going to be tough trying to hack it out there in the territories. But yeah, that was one incentive that the government gave for immigration, was the Homestead Act. Okay, well, people were arriving from Europe during the Civil War, after the Civil War, in the decades that followed. After the late 1880s, when Europeans arrived this way, they would usually come into Ellis Island there in New York City. You can see in our little picture that we have the Statue of Liberty there at Ellis Island. A lot of these European immigrants would have been held at Ellis Island for a few days, sometimes a couple of weeks, just to test for sicknesses, diseases. Truth be told, the vast majority of European immigrants at first were let into the country with very few questions asked. The only times really that they would not allow people into the country at that point in time were like for some genetic deformities and things like that. But otherwise, the vast majority of European immigrants were just let right on in. Now, later on in the country's history, like specifically in the 1920s, you'll start to see this backlash against, well, they'll call it Southern European immigration. It'll be this backlash against Italian immigration into the United States. It comes a little bit later. But truth be told, man, after the Civil War, for the most of those decades, Europeans were just let right on in with very few questions asked. There were Asian immigrants coming into the United States at the same time as well. China, Japan, Korea, people were heading from there. Arriving in San Francisco, they didn't really have like a big statue to greet them as they were coming into San Francisco. I guess they had Alcatraz, the prison, the Rock out there. There wasn't even a Golden Gate Bridge at that time. But in arriving in San Francisco, it's really a sad story. Like, as long as we needed work on railroads and work in mining operations, Asian immigration really wasn't restricted too much at all. But once there was a feeling that there were enough workers in the country, you see this very swift backlash against Asian immigration. We'll talk later on about laws being passed. There was a law called the Chinese Exclusionary Act that'll be passed along the way. And, I wish I could give you some great explanation for this, but I'm just going to simply tell you what it is. It's racism. They just simply saw these Asian immigrants as un-American. They didn't have the same religions, same customs, things like that. So at first, Asian immigration was allowed in the country. Very few questions asked. But then once the railroads were mostly completed and the mining operations didn't need that many workers, really swift backlash against Asian immigration in the decades to come. But whether it was in the East Coast or the West Coast, what happened in the big cities like New York, San Francisco, is you started to see these immigrant enclaves popping up. You look at New York City, for example, it's got a Chinatown, it's got a Little Italy. It's just got these enclaves, these little boroughs within the big cities themselves. And it just turns out that birds of a feather do flock together. People tend to gravitate to others who are like them. It's a very natural human thing to do. But for a lot of these people who arrive in, say, a New York City, their feeling was one of, if I wanted to live in a smaller version of Italy, I would have just stayed back in Italy. I came here for something different, a new experience, this thing called America. So immigrant enclaves did pop up, but there were other people who arrive in the United States, and they're looking for reasons to head west. They're looking for economic opportunity out west. There's another problem with those immigrant enclaves. As I mentioned before, you have high unemployment rates, especially along the eastern seaboard of the United States. You just got a lot of people looking for the few jobs that do exist at that moment in time. So we need these people, all of them really, just as many of them as we can, to move out west, to take the train and head west. That's fine, but you've got to give them economic opportunity and reasons for heading west. And as it turns out, there were reasons that you could head west. There were ways to make money if you were willing to head out west and, take some risks. Just be adventurous, I guess you could say, and head out west to try to seek new opportunities. So in looking at those reasons for heading west, the first one we'll look at is the farming frontier. Then we'll look at the mining frontier, or digging for gold and silver and things like that. And last not least, we'll look at the ranching frontier, which is pretty near and dear to our Texas area, for sure. But in looking at the farming frontier, there were a lot of people who headed out west to the Great Plains. Many of them would use the Homestead Act to claim that free land. And yeah, you see a lot of people moving out west to try to farm, to try to scratch out a living in the earth. A lot of these people would earn the nickname sod busters. Sod is just simply earth. They're moving out west to bust up the earth, to dig into the ground. So sod busters was kind of a nickname, and it wasn't a nice nickname either. It was kind of a slandering these people. But sod busters were the people who moved to the west to use the Homestead Act to try to get that free land and grow crops, grow corn, wheat, barley, all that sort of stuff. Here in the picture that I put up, you can see that's a sodbuster home. You got mom and pa with the kids out in front of said home. It might be a little bit hard to tell because it's so small, but that sodbuster home is actually made out of grass. What sodbusters would do is they would take strands of grass and sort of mix it in with dirt, mud, soup concoction type thing. Sort of make it look like bricks, let it dry, and then stack them one on top of the other on top of the other to build these homes. You really didn't have a lot of lumber or timber, wood, if you will, out there in the Great Plains. There's not a lot of forests. So these people had to adapt to their environment and overcome the obstacles and build things like sodbuster homes, which they said when it rained, like their roofs would collapse. You know, their whole little mud concoction home would just disintegrate in the rain. The winds would come sweeping down the plains and knock out the sidewalls or the back porch or something like that. So these weren't the sturdiest of buildings, but I guess they did what they had to do. Now, Native American raids happened along the Great Plains of the United States, so it was not that uncommon for families like this to suddenly get hit by, say, an Apache raiding party looking for some corn, food, or something of value. So it was really hard to scratch out a living off the earth out west. Native Americans, lack of timber. Now they talked about how when it came time to cook food, they didn't have wood to cook, to burn, so they would burn things like it's kind of disgusting, but they would go out and pick up buffalo poop or cow chips, and they would basically just catch that stuff on fire. And that's how they would oftentimes cook their food. I couldn't imagine the smell of all that, but you do what you got to do. Now, if these people could hack it, and that's tough, but if they could endure those 5 years of living out there in those conditions, I mean, they were sitting in prime real estate area. It's like the breadbasket of the United States, the Great Plains. And there was really so much money to be made off growing corn, wheat, rye, oats, barley. You just kind of had to wait for the railroads to get out that way. And then they could take your crops to a market and you could get compensated for your hard work. But in those early days, like 1860s, 1870s, even on into the 1880s, this is a tough world, this sodbuster life, trying to scratch out that living. In fact, for a lot of these sodbuster families, they'd be out there for maybe a year or two, but then they'd just kind of pack it up and move back east, try to find factory work or something where they could survive. Because I couldn't imagine putting little ones through all that. You see these little kids posing out there on the ground. That's a really tough world to put some little ones through. And if you'll remember, with the Homestead Act, you have to be there for 5 years to get the land for free. For a lot of these sodbuster families, though, after a year or two, they gave up. And they'd head back east looking for I guess more reliable work is what you could call it. But again, if they could hack it out, if they could survive, there really was prime real estate there for them. They'd get basically for free if they could endure 5 years in those conditions. All right, now looking at the mining frontier, this is about digging for precious metals. In your mind, think gold, silver, copper, things like that. We really needed these mining operations to take place, especially when the country switches over to the gold standard, if you'll remember that. We've talked about previously. If we're issuing currency based on how much gold we have in the treasury, then more gold means more money being printed, right? More ones, fives, tens. So yeah, we had mining operations out west. We had people digging out there digging for gold, silver. Eventually, copper became something that we would need. We would dig out for copper. A lot of the copper actually was dug up in the northern areas. I think Minnesota, places like that. But once the telephone became a thing, and then once electricity became a thing, we needed copper wiring to conduct that electricity and things like that. So there were a lot of precious metal digs taking place out west. This was a way that you could make money. You could either get out there and panhandle on your own, or you could sign up with some big operation and work for them for steady pay. But in a lot of those operations that were funded out west, it's really guys like J.P. Morgan, for example, who invested heavily in Western mining operations. A lot of Northeast funding was used in those dig sites. And with that Northeast funding came a lot of those Northeast attitudes towards labor in general. Just the labor exploitation. A lot of the same things that the factory workers were facing. You'll remember long hours, low wages, unsafe conditions, layoffs, things like that. They were facing that and then some out west in those mining operations. Tremendous amount of labor exploitation out west. In fact, you could argue it was worse out west than it was back east. Because like there's no really major cities out there. There's not what you would call major newspapers out there to sort of like shine a light on what was going on and what was wrong. And like a lot of times in these mining operations, these people were put through very dangerous conditions. Working with TNT explosives, dynamite, if you will, in an age before safety regulations really were a major thing. Digging inside of caves and in rock formations. A lot of times these guys would be using these powered drills, like steam powered drills. And in doing so, they'd be kicking up like fragments of rock. And at first, nobody was thinking about using things like a breathing mask. And so they would be getting those little shards of rock that would kick up in the air into their lung sacs. And eventually these people would just die these horrible deaths as their lung sacs were full of shards of rock, or really tiny shards of rock formation that would get into their lungs. So yeah, you could argue that it was more dangerous working out west, and the exploitation was even worse out west, like even longer hours, even lower pay than there was back east. I would say of the three frontiers, the farming, the mining, and the ranching, the mining was probably the least appealing of the three. But it was a way that you could make money. It was a job that you could get, if you will, out west. But something else that absolutely transforms the west of the United States is the ranching frontier, what we call the so-called cattle craze that took off after the U.S. Civil War. Now, this is all about Texas Longhorn cattle. Our part of the world that we're from, the Fort Worth region, is big in the cattle industry and the cattle craze. You can see here on this map that we have with our outline, you kind of look at the bottom of Texas, and you see there's a little cattle there, and you've got all these trails coming out of South Texas. These were basically the cattle drives that would take place back then. Well, the story with Texas Longhorn cattle actually goes back centuries before the Civil War. You go back to the age of the Spanish first arriving in modern-day Mexico. We would have called it New Spain back then. They brought with them cattle, and cattle were just simply allowed to graze and multiply and migrate and move all over Mexico. They eventually would move all the way up to modern-day Texas, where they would be in sort of the southern part of the state of Texas. And I don't know, you're talking about just a lot of heads of cattle down in South Texas, up in Mexico or northern Mexico, who've just been grazing, multiplying. Even in the time of, say, the Texas Revolution, when Texas was fighting to gain its independence from Mexico, you had Tejano ranchers or Hispanic Texans who were ranching out there in South Texas as well. But during the U.S. Civil War, it's really when this sort of cattle craze is going to get its start. In the American South, think Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, places like that, food was becoming a bit of a problem for the Confederacy during the Civil War. They slaughtered so many pigs, so many chickens. They're kind of low on food supply. So the Confederacy turned to Texas beef, Texas cattle, to try to feed the population and try to feed its army. So some enterprising cowboys would round up cattle in South Texas, drive them out to the Gulf of Mexico, where they'd be picked up on boats, taken to various parts of the South, where they'd be butchered for the beef. And this fed people during the Civil War. And what was really born out of a necessity just to keep people alive turned into kind of an industry after the war. Because when the war was over with, people across the South were saying things like, hey, beef tasted pretty good. The steak was pretty good. That chili meat wasn't so bad. So there's this demand that drives up for cattle, for beef, after the U.S. Civil War. It gets such a reputation for its good taste that even off to the Northeast, fancy restaurants in New York City and in Boston, they want beef. They want to serve their customers steak. So there's this demand for beef. Texas essentially is sitting on the supply. So Texas Longhorn cattle becomes an industry overnight as cowboys round up the cattle, drive them on any of these trails that you can see here, sending them up north, up to places like Dodge City in Kansas, out there to Cheyenne, Wyoming as well. You can see the Chisholm Trail came right through the Fort Worth area, our part of the world. So cattle drives became a thing, basically overnight. You can imagine these cowboys, these ranch hands, as they drive cattle through Texas, through Oklahoma, up into modern-day Kansas. It had quite an impact on things, these cattle drives did. I guess first we'll look at the economic impact of cattle drives. You know, there's money to be made in all this. You could set yourself up some type of a business in a Dodge City, Kansas, and when the cowboys come into town with their cattle, you know, they sell the cattle, they get their money, and I don't know, they're looking for a hot meal, a warm bath, a hotel room. They want to drink some whiskey, play some cards, do all kinds of things we won't talk about in the classroom. They're going to need a place for their horses to stay, so stables, right? So there's all these various businesses that can pop up in one of these Kansas towns that can make money off of the cattle craze. Then the cowboys eventually, you know, they make their way back to Texas, they make their way back home, and they've still got money in their pocket from the cattle they sold. So that's bringing money into Texas as well. So the economic impact of the cattle drives is it brings money out west, where otherwise there wouldn't have been a market, there wouldn't have been a demand, there wouldn't have been money changing hands out here with these cowboys. Another impact of all this is what these cows do to the environment. They like to graze. I mean, for real, they just eat grass, and continue to eat it. So as they're coming through Texas, they're eating up all the vegetation. Oftentimes they would just wander onto some farmer's property and start eating up his lettuce and stomping all over his corn or, you know, his crops. And so farmers in Texas were pretty upset about the cattle coming through. And that eventually leads to barbed wire, putting up fence posts and using barbed wire to sort of fence off your land, your property, so that cattle couldn't get on it and destroy your crops. And what you saw was the closing down of what used to be an open range across the West. The cattle come through, they destroy people's property, so to protect their property, they put up fencing, put up barbed wire fences, and what had been an open range forever and ever is effectively being closed thanks to these cattle drives. Another sort of environmental impact is wherever the cattle went, they ate up all the grass. So that caused some of the buffalo to have to travel further west, looking for grass as well, looking for their food source, if you will. And that causes some of the Native American tribes in the Great Plains to also travel west because they hunt buffalo for their living. So you put it all together, and it's quite an impact that these cattle drives have on the West. Now, looking at cowboys for just a moment, you know, cowboys were a very diverse group of people. In fact, it might have been the most diverse group of people in America at the time. But there were obviously Anglo cowboys, but there were also Hispanic cowboys, and there were a lot of African American cowboys down in South Texas as well. It's a fairly even mix, truth be told, of the racial component of what it was to be a cowboy. Really, being a cowboy was tough work. It's 24/7, working with animals, working with cattle, working with fences, things like that. And it was a tough job. And really, the color of your skin didn't matter. It really never should ever matter. But it especially didn't matter on those ranches. Because really, it was just a matter of could you trust the guy to your left or to your right to get the job done. You know, you can imagine being out on the Great Plains of the United States in the middle of the night. You got several hundred heads of cattle out there. and there's a thunderstorm on the horizon, or there's a Native American tribe not too far away, and you just had to know that the guy to your left or the guy to your right knew how to use a gun, knew how to work with cattle, if everything fell apart, and really the color of that person's skin did not matter. As whether or not they could get the job done is what really mattered. So being a cowboy was really more about respect than anything else, and being able to trust that guy to your left and or to your right. Now, previously I've talked about how towards the end of the U.S. Civil War, you had a lot of slaves who were taken from, say, Georgia, for example, transported out to Texas. And the idea was, maybe because like if they stayed in Georgia, they were going to be freed as Sherman's army marched through the state of Georgia at the end of the Civil War. So there's a feeling of Texas hadn't really been invaded. Maybe through some miracle, the Confederacy could pull off some type of a win, and you wouldn't lose your slave property if it was being held out in Texas. Emancipation Proclamation working the way it did. So when the war's end came, I told you that there were a lot of African Americans who were traveling across the South looking to reconnect with family and things like that. But it is also true that there were a lot of African American men in particular who stayed in Texas who maybe didn't have a connection to anything, maybe didn't have a wife or kids or something like that. And they knew that, like, if they went back to Georgia, they were probably going to be picking cotton. And they associated that with having been a slave. So instead, they stayed in Texas and they became cowboys and ranch hands and knew how to work with cattle and knew how to use a rope and things like that. In fact, the first rodeos that were ever really held were African American cowboys showing their talent, their skills, their roping abilities, and their riding abilities and things like that. So cowboys really were a diverse group of people. Anglos, Hispanic guys, Hispanic cowboys, vaqueros. A lot of times they would just live in Mexico throughout the year. Then when it was the right time of the year, they'd round up cattle in Mexico, come across the Rio Grande, drive that cattle up into Kansas and get paid, then just come on back down to old Mexico and use the money to take care of their family, things like that. So yeah, the ranching frontier really did have a huge impact on the West. And again, it's not just being a cowboy; it's everything associated with the cattle craze. Setting up a hotel, a saloon, something like that in Dodge City, Kansas, for example, was a way that you could make money off of this as well. Here you have a picture of Texas Longhorn cattle. This isn't like Betsy the milk cow, who's real sweet and has a little bell around her neck. No, these are the big boys with the big horns. Can be ornery at times as well. Here's sort of that classic image of a cowboy. Hollywood ran with this. John Wayne with the big hat, Gary Cooper, all that sort of stuff. The gunslingers. Um, Hollywood always presents a romanticized version of anything, truth be told, but they really romanticized the heck out of what it was to be a cowboy. It really was a diversified racial group. It wasn't just as glamorous as Hollywood made it out to be. Here you have vaqueros, some Hispanic cowboys from the time. And as I was saying, African American cowboys were in South Texas working on those ranches as well. Okay, well, it turns out there are people living out in the West in the Great Plains regions who had been there forever, and they were not necessarily happy to see that the United States was sending people out west out that way. And looking at the last Native American frontiers, anytime you're talking about Native American history, it's a sad history. And a lot of times the trouble comes in the form of gold or some type of wealth that, quote, Anglo-white society is looking to get its hands on. And that's the case here with what's going to happen out west with Native Americans. As you look at the Black Hills region of the Dakota Territory, where in 1872 they discover gold out there. Very quickly after the discovery of the gold, you have a lot of white prospectors showing up in the Dakotas, the Black Hills, with their pickaxes, shovels, They're digging away in the ground. They're looking for gold. They're looking for wealth. And in the process, they're trespassing all over Native American soil. Now, a lot of the land in question up there in the Black Hills region of the Dakota Territory was in the hands of the Sioux tribe. And this is how you spell it, the Sioux. The Sioux had been on that land forever. They even had titles signed by American presidents from the past, saying that the land did in fact belong to them. So the Sioux people essentially were the ones whose land rights are being violated by these prospectors in the Black Hills region of the Dakota Territory. Oftentimes, the Sioux would, ask them to leave, try to go about it in a nice way. At some point along the way, though, you have a scene where white prospectors are digging on Native American holy sites, burial grounds in particular. And the Sioux, and truth be told, the tribes of the Great Plains period were very upset when it was found that prospectors were digging up people's ancestral burial grounds. Basically, when you're digging up grandma and grandpa, people are going to have a problem with that, right? Well, enter into our story this fellow by the name of Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull was a Sioux chieftain. He was a prophet is what he was. And Sitting Bull had this dream where he saw this like wide open field, and all strewn across this wide open field were a lot of dead white bodies. And Sitting Bull, in having his vision, his dream, he basically said that he foresaw the coming of war. He foresaw that the Sioux would defeat the white man, would defeat these prospectors and anyone else who came that way in battle. So Sitting Bull's vision was a kind of a rallying point for the Sioux, but other tribes in the Great Plains region as well. And what happened is the Sioux began to take up arms, and they began to press back and fight back against these prospectors who were digging up Native American lands, in particular holy sites, burial grounds. All right, well, now that you have Americans dying out west, some prospectors getting killed for digging on Sioux property, the United States military decides to send the Army out west. And the Army will arrive in the form of General George Armstrong Custer. He's in charge of something called the U.S. 7th Cavalry. And basically, it'll be Custer's job to head out west to deal with these problems that are happening between the prospectors and the Native Americans. And yeah, it's basically Custer's job to go after Sitting Bull, the Sioux, and try to stop, I guess, the killing, you could say, of those white prospectors. The U.S. 7th Cavalry took the trains as far west as they could, but eventually they got off the trains, mounted up their horses. They rode their horses up into the Dakota Territory and even further out west. And eventually Custer and the U.S. 7th Cavalry will find a large Native American army resting near something called the Little Bighorn Creek. And you can see here there's going to be a big battle there along that creek, the Battle of Little Bighorn, there in June of 1876. Now, those who were in Custer's army, his I guess his officers, his advisors, they felt like the terrain wasn't suitable for an attack that day. Before I get into that, though, just a little bit about Custer's background. He was a decent general during the U.S. Civil War. He did a lot of good for the Union Army during the Civil War. But they said that Custer, he did graduate from West Point. He wasn't last in his class, but if I remember correctly, he was like second to the last in his class. He was really known more for his boldness, his courage, his tenacity, not so much for strategy and things like that. But anywho, Custer was like America's golden child in that moment. He was dashing. He was handsome. He was a great quote. They talked about how he just looked like a Greek hero in his uniform, riding on a horse. So Custer was a very famous American general. The media loved him. He was a kind of a hero type, if you will. So he and the U.S. 7th Cav are the ones that are going to go out west to deal with this. Okay, well, that Little Bighorn, the terrain was flat. The U.S. 7th Cavalry was going to have to ride across wide open terrain, across the Little Bighorn itself, the water, and the terrain just wasn't suitable, if you will, for an attack. That's at least what Custer's officers told him. They said, look, we know where the enemy is. We can follow them. We can wait till we have an advantage to us before we attack. Find a better land for crossing to do battle. But Custer, being very arrogant, just did not believe that the natives could defend themselves. Believed that the natives were a lesser people, heathens, if you will. And he basically said, look, we've come this far. That's the enemy over there across that Little Bighorn River. So, yeah, sound the bugles, saddle up the horses because we're charging. We're going to go off into battle. So Custer and his men saddled up. They charged valiantly into battle. And they were just about wiped out at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Turns out the natives could defend themselves. It turns out the terrain was horrible for an attack. Custer should ought to listen to his men. And most of the U.S. 7th Cavalry will die in this Battle of Little Bighorn. Not all of them did, but most of them were killed there in action. Custer himself was killed in the battle. It's also known as Custer's Last Stand. Battle of Little Bighorn, a.k.a. Custer's Last Stand. Anytime your last name is involved in a title Last Stand, it probably didn't work out very well for you that day. So this is a huge victory for Native Americans. If you had looked at the battlefield when it was over with, you would have seen white bodies strewn across a wide open field. So it also seemed to validate Sitting Bull's vision, his dream. So it sort of validates him as a prophet. And it really was sort of like the last major stand or victory, I guess I should say, for the Great Plains Native Americans. And it was a rallying point of sorts. Like the tribes of the West felt like they could win. They could drive the U.S. Army away. They could keep the United States from expanding out to their area, out to the West. So it's a huge rallying point from a Native American perspective. But from a U.S. government perspective, this is about as low as it can get. It's embarrassing. The country's hero, Custer, is dead. The newspapers just lamented that, the passing of Custer. But there was a feeling within the U.S. military of embarrassment, a feeling of we can't let this happen again. So what it really meant from an American perspective was anger, rage, and a determination to, quote, pacify the West and send a larger army, build more military bases, and sort of, quote, pacify the Native Americans of the West. Not too long after the Battle of Little Bighorn, General Phil Sheridan is going to be sent out west to deal with Sitting Bull and others. Phil Sheridan was a stone cold killer. He's an excellent U.S. general during the Civil War. He was the guy who was in charge of Texas during Reconstruction. When Congress took over and divided the South into military districts, Phil Sheridan was the guy in charge of Texas during all that. But Phil Sheridan knew what he was doing, and when he comes out west, he is calculating, he is methodical. There's this quote of the only good Indian is a dead Indian, which is a horrible quote. But a lot of people attribute that to William Tecumseh Sherman, General Sherman, who would also head out west during these years. But a lot of people actually say that it was General Phil Sheridan who came up with that quote of the only good Indian was a dead Indian. So that kind of gives you a look into the mindset, if you will, of Sheridan as he's heading out west. But under Sheridan's guidance, you see pacification of the West. Sitting Bull is captured. He'll live out what's left of his life on a reservation. Talk about the growth of the reservations here in a minute as well. So yeah, guys like Sheridan come out west, and they do win battles. They do pacify the West, and Native Americans are slowly but surely starting to lose their land and their way of life out west as the military is showing up in larger numbers. Now, something else that happened along the way was the almost extinction of the buffalo. It's crazy. Buffalo was probably the most plentiful animal on this continent when the Spanish were first beginning to arrive in, say, the early 1500s. There's talk of millions of heads of buffalo roaming across the American West. But in the latter part of the 1800s, buffalo were hunted just about to the point of extinction. Now, there have always been these conspiracy theories that the United States government intentionally killed buffalo as a way of hurting Native Americans. The idea being that, for a lot of these Great Plains tribes, the buffalo was everything. It was how they made their clothing, their teepees, their food. It was a religious symbol for them. And that if the buffalo is basically all but extinct, then natives have to turn somewhere else for food. Here come the reservations to teach them how to farm, and that's how they can get their food. I mean, you can box it in and it fits neatly into a story. But truth be told, the buffalo were almost made extinct by just big game hunters, just hunters who headed out west to bag these animals. And you can read stories about soldiers traveling by train out west. As the train goes by, they see herds of buffalo out there on the plains. And so these soldiers will go grab their weapons and open up the windows of the train and just fire at the buffalo for target practice. Sadly, those things did happen, but that's not going to trigger like the extinction of an entire species. What actually happened was capitalism, industry, if you will. It turns out buffalo hides were very valuable. Their hides could be used to make belts, clothing. One other thing that the buffalo hide was used for was like not just belts that humans would wear, but like belts that could connect machinery. You've got all these machines back east in these factories turning and twisting and whirring around. You've got to have belts to connect the wheels to connect the various machines. So yeah, that leather, that hide was used for industrial equipment as well. So really it was big game hunters that just about wiped the buffalo out at that time. But good news, I hear he's been making a comeback. He's made such a comeback in today's world that they're taking him off the endangered species list. So yeah, buffalo were almost hunted to the point of extinction. But they're making a comeback in today's world. But it does matter in the sense of Native Americans are looking for food. They're having to turn to other sources for that food. And then just sort of into that steps reservations along the way as well. And here you can see we have Custer on the left looking rather dashing in his officer's uniform. You have Sitting Bull there on the right, the prophet who had that vision. Here's General Phil Sheridan, the guy who really did pacify the West. And these guys, this is a massive stack of buffalo hides that these guys are no doubt going to process and send back east to be turned into clothing, belts, industrial things for the industrial machinery back east, things like that. Okay, well, in talking about the reservations, and they'll start popping up out west. These reservations were designed to, I guess, quote, Americanize the native people who were living out west. More than anything, what was happening on these reservations was forced farming. The U.S. government was trying to teach natives how to grow their own food, how to become farmers in a sense. Sorry about that. They're trying to Americanize the Native Americans, turn them into farmers, if you will. Now, a lot of what's also going on in these reservations is something called the white man's way. It's this thing that's become all the rage in Europe. It really starts in England and it goes to other places very quickly. But the white man's way was this idea that white society, Anglo-European-based societies, were superior. That the white man's way was the better way of life. That the white man's way was based in Christianity, industrialization, factories, just that the white man's way was a better way. There was actually a poem by the English poet Shelley in which he was describing the white man's way. And in his poem, Shelley was actually talking about the white man's way being something that could help the world. that it was something that could be taught to other people so that they could raise themselves up, and have these blessings of Christianity and industry and a better way of life. It was a very sort of paternalistic view, fatherly, paternalistic way of looking at the rest of the world. One could also argue it was a very racist way of looking at the world. But the British really felt like in forming colonies in, say, South Africa, that they were bringing the white man's way to the continent of Africa. That they were bringing the white man's way to Australia, for example. That it was a good thing to teach these people industry and Christianity and the English language. Okay, well, that same mentality, that same mindset was in the United States at the time as well. And these people who were setting up reservations, who believed in the white man's way, they really thought that they were doing God's work on earth, that like they were saving souls and they were helping people. Never mind that these people already had their own religion, their own languages, their own values and customs. No, the white man's way was going to be taught to these people to give them a better way of life. Well, the white man's way in the United States had three primary ideas behind it. And the three ideas are, so number one would be an English education, teaching them to read and write the English language. Number two would have been to teach them how to farm, again, forced farming, teach them how to grow crops. And number three would have been teaching them about Christianity, bringing them to believe in Jesus, if you will, in the Bible. So one more time, the white man's way is really about an English education, forced farming, and Christianity. Excuse me. When they first talked to Sitting Bull about Christianity, about Christ, there was an interpreter there trying to explain. A pastor was talking and an interpreter was explaining. And at some point, Sitting Bull just died laughing when he was hearing the stories. And Sitting Bull just, his response was to say, these people believe in fairy tales. That this is crazy stuff. So that kind of lends to this idea that it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. And the U.S. government realized, and those who were trying to preach the white man's way realized, you probably weren't going to convert a Sitting Bull, right? An older adult native. But the kids you could get to, right? You could get to the youngins. And you'll see these, quote, Indian schools pop up back east. There was a really big one in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where basically young Native American boys were taken from their tribes out west, shipped by train back east to places like Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where they would get an education in English, agriculture / farming, and the Bible, Christianity. Here you can see in this picture that we put up, or that I put up, you've got these two young men sitting at a table. They're Native Americans. Their hairstyle is very Anglo. Three-piece suits that they're wearing. They're reading books, no doubt in English. So yeah, the white man's way also did that. It indoctrinated young Native Americans into English farming and Christianity. And then once these young men had graduated from the quote Indian school, they would be shipped back west to sort of be ambassadors for their tribe, for their people. They would bring what they had learned out to the reservations out west. And that's what the white man's way was about, was basically, quote, Americanizing the natives. Now, this last point here in looking at the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, this is basically a concept of the pen being mightier than the sword. And this is really how the West was won, was through this legislation called the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. Okay, if you looked at the West and if you looked at the land that tribes, quote, owned, you're looking at about 150 million acres of land out west that belong to the various tribes sort of collectively. That's a lot of land. And you have a United States that is expanding to the west. Railroads are heading to the west. People are moving out west. You have a Homestead Act that allows people to claim 160 acres of land for free. So the U.S. government really wanted to get its hands on as much of that 150 million acres as it possibly could. But the problem is a lot of these tribes had treaties, had title or deeds to the land, if you will. So what the Dawes Severalty Act does is it comes along and it says that tribes, just the legal term tribe, will no longer be viewed as a legal entity when it comes to owning land. Just imagine, if you will, you've got the Sioux, just this collective tribe, this entity, and there's a title that says that the Sioux tribe owns, I don't know, 20 million acres of land. Just, I'm throwing a number out there. Well, you pass the Dawes Severalty Act that says that tribes are no longer viewed as legal entities. That essentially means that the Sioux no longer own that 20 million acres of land. The United States government is not willing to look at a tribe as a legal entity. Once you do that, then what the U.S. government does is it comes in and it gives each adult male Native American 160 acres of land. So it doesn't belong to the children or to the women or to the whole tribe as a group. What they'll do is they'll give each male Native American 160 acres of land, title deed to it. So now let's say instead of owning 20 million acres of land, the Sioux own, through these adult males, I don't know, they own, just throwing a number out there, say 1 million acres of land. So it takes a lot of the land out of their hands as a group, as a people, and it just puts it into the hands of adult males within the tribe. That frees up millions and millions of acres out west for homestead acts, for settlers, for people to just head out to the west. You know, even in looking at the land that was given to those adult males, a lot of times real estate agents would head out west and they would just like sort of buy the land from these natives at really cheap rates. They would get them drunk and get them to sign documents that otherwise they wouldn't have signed. You know, they really just sort of took advantage of these men who own that land after the Dawes Severalty Act. So this is what leads to claiming Native American lands out west. You have people headed that way, Anglos from the east heading out west, using the Homestead Act as a way to get access to the land for free. And what you saw from 1887 forward, 1887 on, was manifest destiny being complete. The United States going from, you know, east coast to west coast. You start to see states, new states popping up, big cities popping up. The railroads are everywhere out west. And you just see that way of life that had been there forever. Like, even before Christopher Columbus was born, these native people were living their life, their way, their style, with their religions and their customs. And it's just gone. That way of life just disappears towards the end of the 1800s. If you travel out west, you can still drive across reservations. You know, you'll just be driving out west and you'll go through Arizona and you'll come across a sign that says, you know, you're entering into a reservation for a certain group. So these tribes still exist. They still do have their reservations. But that open range style of life, that nomadic on a horse, you know, out there on the plains, hunting buffalo, things like that, that way of life is gone for sure. All right, well, that's it for this topic as my dog Clyde begins to bark. You guys have a great afternoon and take care of yourselves. Bye.